I still remember the way the house felt that evening. Heavy, tense, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to snap. The air smelled faintly of roasted chicken and lemon cleaner, but underneath that was something bitter, something old, something I had ignored for years. My parents sat across from me at the long oak dining table, the one they always claimed they bought, even though I had been the one making the payments in quiet installments. My sister, Laura, sat beside them, arms folded, jaw tight. I knew that look. It meant she had already chosen her side. It meant she came prepared to attack. My father slammed his hand on the table first, a sound so sharp it vibrated through my teeth. "You're responsible for her wedding," he shouted, jabbing a finger in my direction as if that would make his demand more logical. "Either pay up or get out of this family forever." My mother leaned forward, her face twisted with indignation. "You heard your father. You should be contributing. Laura is your sister. Families help each other. Families help each other." The words almost made me laugh. I swallowed the urge, forcing myself to stay silent long enough to hear every piece of their performance. Then Laura chimed in, pushing her chair forward until its legs screeched against the floor. "You should be ashamed, Janice," she spat. "You live under this roof. You owe us. It's the least you can do." Something inside me shifted then, slowly, quietly, like the cracking of ice across a frozen lake. A calmness washed over me, not warm, but cold and sharp, as if it had been waiting for this moment for years. I looked at each of them, really looked, and suddenly all the pieces of my life with them clicked into place. Every ignored sacrifice, every unthanked effort, every dollar I had scraped together while they pretended they were doing me a favor by letting me sleep in a house that I had been paying for. They never asked how the mortgage stayed current when neither of them had steady work. They never wondered how the electric bill was covered or why the water heater magically got repaired every time it broke. They never thought to question how a place in Maple Ridge, Colorado, stayed afloat all those years. I pushed my chair back. The sound sliced through the room like a blade. Their expressions stiffened as they watched me stand. My mother blinked rapidly, as if she sensed something in me she hadn't seen before. My father opened his mouth, ready to fire off another threat, but I didn't let him speak. "You have one day," I said, my voice steady, almost frighteningly so. "One day to get out of my house." The silence that followed was immediate and immense. It felt like all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. My father frowned, his eyebrows pulling together so tightly they almost touched. "Your house?" he repeated, as if he had misheard me or as if the sheer absurdity of the idea offended him. I slipped my hand into my pocket and pulled out the folded documents I carried for months, not because I planned to show them, but because I needed the reminder that the truth existed even when no one believed me. I placed the papers on the table. The contract. The amendment. The final note from the mortgage company confirming that after 5 years of consistent payments, my payments, the property now legally belonged to me. Their names had been a formality, a shield I used years ago because I didn't want them to feel embarrassed in front of neighbors. And in return, they treated me as if I were the embarrassment. My mother grabbed the papers first. Her hands trembled so much the pages rattled. Her eyes darted across the text, widening with each line. My father leaned in, breathing heavily, reading over her shoulder. Laura simply stared, her arms loosening, confidence draining from her face like water from a cracked cup. You paid this?" my mother whispered. "For 5 years," I answered. "Every bill, every tax, every repair, every last dollar came from me." "That's not possible," my father said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You work a simple job in Denver. There's no way." I worked 3 jobs for 2 years. I cut in, then 2 jobs after that. I stopped going out. I stopped buying anything unnecessary. I saved every paycheck, every tip, every bonus. You never asked how I kept the house running because you didn't care. You assumed I owed you. You assumed you were entitled to everything I earned. My sister shook her head, anger rising again. "Why didn't you tell us?" "Because you never asked," I said quietly. The silence settled again, thicker this time, filled with all the years of resentment I had swallowed. I watched as the reality sank into their faces. My father stepped back as if he had been struck. My mother pressed her lips together, tears pooling in her eyes, not out of remorse, I knew, but out of humiliation. Laura looked lost, like a child whose game had suddenly ended. Then came the begging. My mother reached across the table first. "Janice, honey, wait, this is all a misunderstanding. We didn't mean it. We were stressed about the wedding, and maybe we said things too harshly." My father cleared his throat, struggling to find words that could repair the damage. "We shouldn't have yelled. You know family can get emotional." Laura leaned toward me, eyes wide. "We're sorry, okay? Don't take this too far." But their apologies rolled off me like rain hitting stone. I wasn't angry anymore, not in the explosive way they expected. I was done. Completely done. I turned from the table and walked toward the hallway, feeling strangely weightless, as if I had removed a coat I didn't know I'd been wearing my entire life. I paused in the doorway and looked back at them, the three people who had shaped me, used me, depended on me, and never once saw me. "You have one day," I repeated. "Pack your things and leave. The keys stay here. The house stays here. I stay here." I didn't wait for their response. I walked down the hallway to my bedroom and shut the door. For the first time in years, the click of the latch brought me peace instead of isolation. I leaned against the door and let out a slow breath, one I felt I had been holding for half a decade. The weight lifted. The noise stopped. The fear dissolved. For the first time in my life, I had spoken and they had finally heard me. After they left the house the next morning, quietly, bitterly, clutching boxes they packed in the early hours before sunrise, I stood alone in the living room and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Space. The walls, once heavy with arguments and footsteps and tension thick enough to taste, seemed to expand around me. The air suddenly felt lighter, the whole house almost breathing as if relieved that chaos had finally stepped out the front door. I closed my eyes and let the silence wrap around me. It didn't feel empty. It felt earned. It felt mine. I walked slowly through the hallway, fingertips brushing the walls I had repainted last summer. I had done it quietly, late at night when everyone was asleep, using paint I bought with the leftovers of my paycheck. The color, soft gray, was chosen after months of wanting something peaceful, something neutral, something that didn't remind me of the tension that constantly hung in the air. My parents never noticed. They barely noticed anything I did unless it benefited them. And when I think back on it now, it amazes me how blind people can be when they only see you as a resource instead of a person. The kitchen was the next place I visited, my footsteps echoing lightly on the tile. I remembered how the old counters were cracked when we first moved into the house, how the cabinets sagged on loose screws, and how the sink leaked every winter. My father always claimed he would fix it next week. Next week never came. So, after saving for months, I finally hired someone from town to help me install new counters. I stood beside him the whole time, learning, asking questions, handing him tools. I paid $450 in cash, money that had taken me weeks to gather, but the moment the new counters were in place, I felt proud in a way my parents would never understand. They never thanked me. They never even acknowledged the change. They simply used the kitchen as if the world had gifted it to them. But the living room, small and square with a sunspot that appeared every morning at 9, had always been the heart of my quiet rebellion. Every piece of furniture in that room had come from secondhand stores or garage sales. I had spent no more than $600 total furnishing it. A dark blue sofa with one loose button. A wooden coffee table with scratches that told a longer story than the person who sold it to me. A bookshelf I built myself with planks of what I found behind an old hardware shop. They were imperfect pieces, worn and simple, but they were mine. Every dollar mattered, and every decision had meant something. I sank into the sofa, letting out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. Without their voices, without their accusations or demands or insults disguised as advice, I suddenly felt aware of the quiet dreams that had lived inside me. Dreams I'd pushed down because survival required more energy than hope. My mind drifted to the early days in Maple Ridge, back when the house was still under their names. Back when I had thought putting it in their names would make them proud of me, proud that I had managed something big, something responsible, something rare for someone my age. I never imagined it would give them a sense of ownership not only over the property, but over me. It didn't take long for their pride to twist into entitlement. Suddenly everything I paid for became something they claimed. Every upgrade became theirs. Every bill I covered was expected, not appreciated. They always treated me like a spare piece of their life. Useful, but not valued. A substitute. A backup plan. Never the daughter who had worked herself to the bone to make sure they had a roof over their heads. I had worked 3 jobs in those early years. Not one person in that house knew what it felt like to drag yourself home at 2 in the morning after a late shift at the call center in Denver, your whole body vibrating from exhaustion, your fingers stiff from typing customer notes under fluorescent lights. They never knew how my feet ached after standing 8 hours at the bakery in Riverbend, frosting pastries while customers barked orders. And they never knew how cold my hands became when I cleaned condos in Silver Glen every weekend, scrubbing floors and changing sheets while the owners relaxed on vacations that cost more money than I'd ever seen in my bank account. But I kept going because I had a dream, one that no one could take from me, one I didn't need their approval for. I wanted something that belonged to me entirely, something no one could hold over my head, something that could not be manipulated or stolen or twisted into guilt. The house was supposed to be that dream, and eventually it became one. I still remember the day I made the last payment. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the sky over Denver a dull shade of silver. I parked outside the mortgage office, hands sweating despite the cold, and walked inside carrying an envelope with the final $1,200 savings, money that emptied my account, leaving me with barely enough for groceries. But it didn't matter. I'd never cared about living comfortably. I cared about living freely. When the clerk stamped the final document, verifying that the contract had shifted ownership to me, I felt something powerful rush through me. I stepped outside, envelope now empty, papers in hand, and sank onto a bench near the parking lot. For the first time in years, I cried, not out of sadness or fear, but out of triumph. My tears weren't heavy. They were cleansing. Every drop felt like a piece of my old life leaving my body. I pressed the papers to my chest, feeling their weight, their promise. I had done it. I had carved out a piece of the world for myself. But I should have known peace never lasts long in a house full of people who hate seeing someone else obtain it. I just didn't expect the fight to happen the very next week. I didn't expect the screams over the dining table, the demands, the manipulations, the attempt to break me one last time. I didn't expect that my final step into independence would come wrapped in betrayal. Yet now, standing in the quiet of my own home, the truth was undeniable. Their final outburst had given me exactly what I needed, the strength to finally speak, and the courage to finally walk away. This house was no longer a battleground. It was my beginning. The first morning after they left, I woke up to a silence so gentle it almost felt like a presence. Sunlight filtered through the blinds in thin ribbons, landing across the hardwood floor like soft gold. For years I had associated mornings with tension, my father's heavy footsteps, my mother's sharp sighs, my sister's complaints echoing down the hallway. But that morning, all I heard was the quiet hum of the heater and the soft tick of the clock beside my bed. It felt unreal, like stepping into a new world built inside the skeleton of the old one. I didn't rush to get up. I didn't feel the weight of obligation pulling me toward the kitchen to prepare anything for anyone. I simply breathed, deeply, freely, and let the stillness settle into me. After a slow breakfast of toast and black coffee, I walked to the front door and stared at it for a long moment. For years, that door had been a symbol of everything I felt trapped behind, everything I wanted to step away from but never did. That day, it looked back at me almost expectantly. So I went to the hardware store in downtown Maple Ridge, bought a gallon of forest green paint for $32, and came home with a determination I hadn't felt in years. I laid down old newspapers on the porch, dipped the brush into the thick green paint, and pressed the first stroke onto the wood. The color seeped into the grain immediately, rich and calm. With every stroke, I felt layers of old memories fade under the fresh coat. By the time I finished, the door looked like it belonged to a different life entirely, one I had finally claimed. Inside the house, I moved from room to room, gathering pieces of my past I no longer wanted to hold. I tore down the curtains my mother loved, the ones she insisted made the house look respectable. They'd never felt like mine. I tossed them into a donation box. I opened all the windows, letting in the cold Colorado wind. It swept through the house like a cleansing spirit, pushing away the stale remnants of years spent accommodating people who never appreciated me. For the first time, I felt the house respond, breathing with me, opening with me, changing with me. That afternoon, I called my best friend, Evelyn. She had known about the chaos in my home but had never pushed me to leave it sooner. She understood that some decisions have to come from within, not from someone else's encouragement. When she heard the news, she didn't gasp or lecture or question. She simply said, "I'm coming over," and hung up. 2 hours later, she pulled into my driveway in her dusty blue sedan, carrying a box of warm muffins from a bakery in Brighton and a bottle of cheap wine that probably cost no more than $15. We sat together on the porch steps, letting the sun fall behind the mountains as she listened to everything I said. I told her how it felt to finally speak up. I told her how their faces looked when I showed them the contract. I told her how quiet the world felt now. "This place feels like you now," she said softly, glancing at the newly painted door. "It finally looks like someone lives here who loves herself." Her words struck deep, not because they were dramatic, but because they were true. For so long, I had worked to survive, not to live. I had taken care of everything and everyone except myself. And now, standing on my own porch with someone who cared about me, I felt something inside me shift again. Something warm, something steady, something new. Later that month, when the world had settled into its new rhythm, I met Daniel. It happened unexpectedly, the way real turning points usually do. I was at a small wildlife photography exhibit in Denver, a place I visited only because I desperately needed to step outside of Maple Ridge for a while. He was standing near a display of a fox curled under winter branches, adjusting one of the frames. He had soft brown eyes and a gentle steadiness to his movements. There was nothing hurried about him, nothing sharp, nothing loud. He introduced himself as a traveling wildlife photographer from Portland, Maine, and somehow the conversation extended effortlessly, as if neither of us had planned to speak, but both of us needed to. We met again a week later, and then again the week after that. He never asked about my family or my past, though he sensed there was something there. Instead, he let me speak when I wanted to, and when I didn't, he simply stayed beside me in silence. We started taking weekend trips together, driving through small American towns like Cedar Hollow, Riverbend, and Pinecrest, places quiet enough to hear your own thoughts, places where no one knew me or the life I had escaped. Each trip felt like stepping further into a world I didn't know I was allowed to want. Sometimes we stopped at tiny diners with chipped mugs and pancakes bigger than the plates. Sometimes we walked down empty main streets where the only sound was the wind brushing against the storefront signs. In those moments, I didn't feel like someone who had been broken down by years of emotional burden. I felt like someone discovering herself for the first time. On one trip, I paid for a hotel using pounds I had saved from a short visit to Europe years earlier. It wasn't necessary, but it felt symbolic, like reclaiming a part of myself I had tucked away because life at home had demanded all of me. Standing at the check-in counter, handing over those pounds I had guarded for years, I felt a spark of joy rise inside me. It wasn't about the money. It was about choosing myself. And slowly, day by day, piece by piece, I stopped feeling like the girl they had tried to break. I started feeling like the woman I was becoming, stronger, braver, clearer. Every step I took away from my old life brought me closer to the one I was learning to create. I didn't know exactly where this journey would lead, but for the first time ever, the uncertainty didn't scare me. Because now, the life ahead of me was mine to build. Months rolled by in a steady rhythm, the kind that settles into a home only after the storm has passed. The seasons shifted from the warm gold of late summer to the crisp bite of autumn, and with every change in the air, I felt something inside me change too. The house, once filled with shouting, footsteps, and tension that seeped into the walls, slowly transformed into a place of calm. In the early mornings, soft light streamed through the bedroom curtains. I had finally picked out myself, washing the room in pale amber. In the evenings, I would sit by the fireplace with music humming low in the background, a journal open across my lap, words flowing out of me that I hadn't allowed myself to write before. The silence no longer reminded me of what I'd lost. It reminded me of what I had gained. Sometimes, when I walked through the living room, I caught glimpses of the past, my father's raised voice, my mother's cold stares, my sister's sharp tongue, but they felt like faded shadows, unable to reach me anymore. I had taken the time to repaint the walls again, this time choosing a warm ivory instead of gray. I wanted the house to feel like a blank page, a fresh beginning. Every brushstroke felt like I was erasing another scar. And the house didn't just look different. It felt different. It finally felt like a place built for peace, not for battles. Daniel visited often, never pushing, never taking up more space than I invited him into. He brought small gifts from his work trips, photographs of deer in the forests of Montana, a postcard from an exhibit in Vermont, a pine cone from a trail he hiked outside of Bend, Oregon. Gentle things, thoughtful things, things that felt like steady hands offering warmth instead of control. I didn't let him stay over at first. I was still learning what it meant to see my home as mine and no one else's. But he understood that too, and he never made me feel like I owed him anything. In a world where people had always demanded pieces of me, his patience felt like a rare, quiet kindness. It wasn't until late December, when snow covered Maple Ridge in a soft white blanket, that the letter arrived. It was a thick envelope, the kind that carried too many words written out of desperation, guilt, or fear. When I saw my mother's handwriting on the front, my chest tightened for a moment, but not in the way it used to. The old fear was gone. What I felt instead was a small distance, a steady calm, like standing behind a locked door with the key safely in my hand. I opened it slowly. Sitting at the dining table, I'd refinished myself in early autumn. The first page began with a familiar sentence. We didn't mean what we said. The next pages were filled with excuses, about stress, about finances, about misunderstandings they insisted had shaped their behavior. They admitted they shouldn't have yelled. They said they had been overwhelmed. They tried to paint themselves as victims of circumstance, never truly acknowledging the years of disrespect and entitlement. Then came the guilt. We're still your family. You shouldn't turn your back on us. We need you. My sister even wrote a short paragraph of her own, apologizing in sentences that felt copied from something she'd been told to say. She claimed she missed me, that she didn't know things had gotten so serious, as if my quiet suffering had been a private joke I'd kept from her. And finally came the pleading. They wanted me back, not to love me, not to rebuild trust, but to return to the role they had always placed me in, the one who carried their burdens, paid their bills, solved their problems, and kept the household afloat while they took credit for everything. I read every page without rushing, letting the weight of their words settle properly before I closed the envelope. Then I folded each sheet neatly and placed it in the drawer beside my bed. I didn't tear it up. I didn't write back. I didn't react with anger or satisfaction. I simply put it away, exactly where it belonged in the past. Walking away from them had taught me that silence can be a powerful answer. Not every wound deserves to be reopened. Not every apology deserves acceptance. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is to refuse to return to the places that broke you. As winter deepened, I found new routines. I took long evening walks around Maple Ridge, admiring the way the streetlights cast a soft glow over the snow. I cooked meals for myself that I never had the time or energy to prepare before, soups filled with fresh vegetables, pastas with herbs I grew in small pots on the windowsill. I discovered that I loved late-night writing sessions, the kind that made the hours slip away unnoticed. And sometimes, when the loneliness of independence crept in, I reminded myself that solitude was not the same as emptiness. For the first time, being alone meant being safe. One cold morning in February, I stepped out onto the porch with a steaming mug of coffee. The mountains in the distance were covered in snow, their peaks glowing pink under the sunrise. I stood there for a long time, feeling the wind brush against my cheeks, feeling the solid wood of the porch beneath my feet. I wrapped my fingers around the mug, taking in the warmth. The house behind me, this home I fought for, paid for, protected, was quiet and steady. It no longer echoed with anger, no longer shook under tension, no longer felt like a place I was trapped inside. It felt like mine. My peace was no longer fragile. It was rooted deep, like the tall pine trees in the backyard. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need forgiveness from people who never offered it to me. I didn't need to reopen wounds that had finally healed. As I looked toward the mountains, the air crisp in my lungs, I whispered to myself words I had never imagined I would say, the truth of them settling into me with certainty. I walked away, and that was the day I finally became free.